Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this month's Black History Series presentation titled Beyond Freedom, Black North American Border Crossers in the Emancipation Generation with Dr. Adam Arenson. Adam Arenson is a professor and chair of history at Manhattan College. His expertise is 19th century North America, especially the cultural and political history of slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, and emancipation. He's the author of two award-winning books, The Great Heart of the Republic, St. Louis and the Cultural Civil Wars, and Banking on Beauty, Miller's Sheets, and Mid-Century Commercial Architecture in California. Also co-editor with Andrew Graybill of Civil War Wests, Testing the Limits of the United States, and co-editor with Jay Gitlin and Barbara Berglund of Frontier Cities Encounters at the Crossroads of Empire. His current research after the Underground Railroad is a political, economic, and family history of the collective experience of African North Americans crossing the U.S. Canada border, mostly moving south during and after the Civil War. He is co-writing a book on select Black North American border crossers with Windsor's Irene Moore Davis to be published by the University of California Press. Dr. Arenson has presented related research in the Journal of American Ethnic History and at the Library of Congress, the Buxton Homecoming Genealogical Conference, the Tubman Center, and in an essay in Unsettling the Great White North, African Canadian History. Arenson also holds an AB in History and Literature from Harvard and a PhD in History from Yale. Very impressive. Before we begin, I just ask that everyone could, while Dr. Arenson is presenting, please turn off your camera and mute your microphone, just so that you don't distract him. Also, following the presentation, there's going to be a Q&A, so just type in your questions in the comment section, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. And at this point, you're also welcome to turn back your microphone, turn it back on. And just one final note, if you would like to support programming such as our Black History series, you can donate by going to our website, amherstburgfreedom.org. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Arenson. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to have an opportunity to present this material, and hopefully we'll have a good chance to discuss it afterwards as well. As you've heard, this is part of a book project I'm working on, and I've had the privilege of visiting with members of the Black North American communities on both sides of the border, and I look forward to coming to Buxton again soon. And I was in Windsor earlier this year, so it's great to present this material and to continue to hear family stories that help us get a bigger picture of what this history might mean. The way I found this project is by visiting the National Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati. The U.S. has built this museum in Cincinnati because Ohio was just across the river from Kentucky, and it marked sort of the beginning of freedom for so many people who had been escaping enslavement in the U.S. South. It's a very detailed museum in some ways. It talks about the origins of African enslavement in the Caribbean. It talks about the ways in which slavery changed in what became the United States. And through floor after floor, it's giving this history. And then suddenly you reach this doorway where it says Beyond Freedom. And after a whole floor dedicated to the Underground Railroad and the paths of the Underground Railroad and how people escaped and conductors and all the wonderful stories we have of that moment of resistance against slavery and against white supremacy, you reach this doorway that says Beyond Freedom. And you can see there's like a mural there that talks about the Civil War and Reconstruction. And even as you go sort of around the wall, there's just a hallway with like pictures of the modern civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and people like that. And then you reach an elevator and you go down to the gift shop, right? So it seemed like, obviously this is a museum trying to focus on what happens before the Civil War, but it really struck me that it had this sense that freedom was the end of the story. Like once people were free, there wasn't a greater story that at least that museum wanted to tell. And similarly, this is a little blurry, I apologize, but on that mural wall, they have this picture that says Black settlements in Upper Canada with a beginning date of 1835 and an ending date of 1870, which having been to Amherstburg and Windsor and Buxton and all these places, obviously these communities, St. Catharines, other places on here, these communities continue to exist, right? So the fact that the museum decided to put an end date on it was a silly decision. And obviously they're emphasizing certain cities, but not others. As you'll see in this presentation, I'm interested in Black border crossers, whether they're in British Columbia or in Nova Scotia, not just in Ontario, Quebec, like all over, right? There's a discussion about what the borders between the United States and what we now call Canada mean, that's bigger than this picture, and it's bigger than that time period of just 1835 to 1870. So I had actually already started this research, but seeing this at the museum really kind of inspired me to go out and help them correct their history and tell a wider story. And I've been working at it for a very long time. But I found a number of sort of interesting pieces of the puzzle of like sort of how things do and don't get emphasized, right? One is that it's been very important to emphasize that there was slavery in what's now Canada. I think that's, obviously a very important fact that I think people hopefully now know, but I think there are lots of people who didn't know that. And so it's been important to talk about the enslavement of First Nations, Native American people, as well as of enslaved Africans in what is now Canada. Similarly, I think that the story of the Underground Railroad is the story that people know the most about, that they really try to emphasize the idea that Canada was this place of freedom after being a place of enslavement. And then I think when it comes to a lot of Black Canadian history, there's a big emphasis on what happens during World War I and after, right? Both the restrictions on immigration and then the greater immigration from the Caribbean and other places that has led to changes in who is present in Canada. But that story really ignores the period that was most interesting to me, which is as someone who's been very interested in what we call Reconstruction in the United States, right? The emphasis on what it meant once slavery was over, how might we build a multiracial democracy, and then unfortunately, how did white supremacist forces end that effort at multiracial democracy and then bring back Jim Crow policies? There's a similar story to be told in about what happens in Canada and of people moving between Canada and the United States in that period. Confederation in 1867 in some ways is a reaction to the fear that the United States will continue to expand and maybe take British Columbia or take another part of what becomes Canada. So that period I found very important, and often it falls out of the history of Black Canadians as well as Black border crossers, right? The emphasis is really on moving to Canada, and the idea is, if you ask an American, they'd say, well, everyone just stayed in Canada forever. And I think in a lot of sources, it says, well, everyone left Canada and went back to the United States. Neither of those things are true, but we haven't had a good history to kind of engage that period. Fred Landon, who is one of the early people who did actually care about Black Canadian history, this is from 1941, and some of the language here you see will reflect that, gives us a version of that myth, right? Since 1865, the Black Canadian is simply a fellow Canadian to those about him, and his life differs in no respect from that of the other hundreds of thousands about him. He is a citizen of Canada, and as such, he is entitled to all the privileges of citizenship, right? This is a very, a nice kind of liberal myth of the idea that, that we don't have to see race, we don't have to think about discrimination because there wasn't any discrimination. But Landon should have been a better historian, given that he did some really remarkable work on the periods of slavery and the periods of Underground Railroad, to know that obviously there was a civil rights struggle in Canada, that there were questions around school desegregation, and that all the questions that existed in the United States. Famously, someone said about Reconstruction that the former slave has nothing but freedom because nothing but freedom has been given him, right? So that when it came to the question of political rights, economic rights, being able to find family, being able to have networks, whether those networks are in churches or in Masonic lodges or in other spaces, there wasn't enough of an effort in either country to sort of really make, a Black Canadian a fellow Canadian, right, to use the language here. And so this is a project that really tries to talk about what really happened between about 1865 and about 1930 in this generation that was the first generation to know emancipation across North America. Okay, I want to get it to shift. There we go. Next slide. Right, so to define the group I'm looking at, I want people who had sort of lived at least with the fear of slavery, right? So whether they lived in what's now Canada or the United States, slavery still existed until 1865. And then I was interested in what the border crossing meant, right? That I think, there are important stories to be told about families that never leave the United States. There are important stories to be told about families that never left Canada or escaped to Canada and then stayed there. But what I found is that in almost every family I've been able to research, even people like Anderson Abbott, who was very proud of being a Black Torontonian, they spend time in the United States, right? That the economy of the United States, the culture of the United States was such that it had a certain draw that people, even who saw themselves as lifelong Canadians, spent some time in the United States. Similarly, though we might think that people who had escaped slavery or who had lived in freedom in the United States might have found space there, I do find records of people moving to Canada much later, right? In the 1890s, even moving from the United States in like the 19-teens. And so I was interested in that border crossing, right? I'm from San Diego. I'm near the US-Mexico border. And so I know that borders build up borderlands, and they built a kind of shared culture near the border. And I wanted to have a better sense of like, were these people crossing just near the border? Were they moving way into the United States or Canada? What were these movements about? And what's the bigger story we might be able to tell? So that's the way the project has been built. Trying to get a sense of the numbers, right? It's probably at least a third of the Underground Railroad, passengers, if you want to think of it that way, who went into Canada. Others probably stopped in Ohio and New York, though after 1850, even those people often moved to Canada. In terms of the return, it probably is something like 80% of the people who come back. Which of course means that about 20% of the Black Canadians and their families stayed. Percentages wise, it's a tiny, tiny percent of the African American population, right? That the vast majority of African Americans had never been able to leave the South and remain there after slavery as well. So it's maybe 1.25% of the entire U.S. Black population had spent time in Canada. But really, it's probably about 3/4, as you can see, of the Canadian Black population, right? So in some ways, this is a story that's a much larger piece of the Black Canadian experience than it is of the Black U.S. experience. But again, I think there's something to be said about this network, and the way the book that Irene and I are working on is going to be structured is really to focus on people who were incredible leaders, some of whom I'll be able to introduce to you today, right? There's definitely families who we can see them only in the census and we have very little information about them. That's true of everyone, of course. But then there are other people who, were all over the newspapers, who had pictures of their weddings, who had, lots of coverage and were well known, whether that was in Seattle or in Detroit or in New York or in Washington, or in, in St. John or in Montreal, right? So I'll get to some of those stories. So as I've discovered, this information has been held by lots of families, I would say mostly, and also by certain community historians in the US and Canada who've really emphasized this, right? I'm not discovering anything. I'm trying to bring together family stories that maybe hadn't been put in conversation with each other, but this is all information that I think is known in lots of families. There are some cases of racial passing and other ways in which this material was forgotten, but this is just a sense of all the libraries and archives I've been to over time. Here's a list of some of the many people, community historians, museums, fellow experts who've been part of this story. And you'll see I have some mapping that I'll be able to show you some of it in this. And this is a group of some of my students and folks at what's called the Columbia University Data Science Institute, where we've been trying to take these massive pieces of information, mostly from the census, and come up with maps that kind of show where are these groups of Black border crosses going, right? That we can tell individual stories, but, for example, I've seen that the Southwestern Ontario region has far more Black Canadians than any other region, more than Toronto, more than Nova Scotia, more than British Columbia, and those are the top four, by the way. And that's something I think I didn't have as good a sense of because so many of the records point to Toronto and point to the maritime provinces. So that's been something I've been able to find. Similarly, I don't know if I would have been able to guess the kind of major cities that people move to. You'll see these maps later on. Detroit is obviously the largest, and that probably you would have guessed. But when it comes to other cities, places like Washington and New York and Boston are and even then eventually places like Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, and like Cleveland and Toledo and other places in Ohio, and other places in Michigan too. So I've been trying to come at this effort in lots of different ways, including my students, including community historians, and really trying to figure out the best way to tell this story. And I'm excited that Irene and I are now under contract with the University of California Press to talk about a certain set of families that we can fit into the book. And then I have ongoing research with these maps that will sort of get into other places where we can sort of visualize these movements as well. Okay, so this is what I mean by the kind of mapping we're doing. You know, the effort has been first to record all these movements, and then also to try to get the line widths to match, like what's one individual, what's hundreds of individuals. You can see that there's a huge number of dots on the eastern half of the United States. If we were to zoom in, that you would see that many of those dots are in Ohio and Michigan. Those are really the dominant places, with another set of folks in Boston and New York coming out of the Maritimes almost always. But you can see the kind of movements I've found are really all over, right? That there was someone on a whaling ship who was out there to Kamchatka in Russia, and Alaska too. Some of those are whaling trips. There are people who had gone to Victoria in some of the early gold rushes, and then later there are people who go to the Klondike Black border crossers. So there's a movement up and down the Pacific coast in that way. The movements to Africa and to England are almost always linked to missionary or temperance movements. So people would go to conferences or go on missions. There's some into the Caribbean. Actually, I can see that Haiti should be marked and is not marked on this map, because I have a family that goes to Haiti as a minister as well. So, you know, part of it was gathering all this data. I probably have found about 15 to 20,000 Black border crossing families. So in terms of how many individuals that is, it kind of depends on if you count, like, well, when their children are born, where do we count that? But I've been trying to gather this information and give us sort of a big map in that way. As I mentioned, this is my 1861 map of where did I think Black Canadians were. It's an estimation in some ways, but you can see that really the peninsula in southwestern Ontario is really the dominant space for Black Canadians, right? So though I think the story of the Black Loyalists, and in some ways the story of the Black families in Victoria, have been emphasized more, there's so many stories in, you know, whether it's in Windsor or in Chatham or in Buxton or in Owen Sound, you know, that are in that section of Ontario that really drive the movement. And you can see from this map, if you're not familiar with the upper Midwest, why obviously Michigan and Ohio are the easiest place for border crossing to happen, right? Because they're just across the lake. And in that period, there were often steamers across the lake. So it was actually probably easier to get from, you know, Toronto to Cleveland, for example, in the 19th century than it is now, because we have to drive around. Here's a close-up. Unfortunately, they're not labeled here, but if you know your local Ontarian geography, you can see everything from Toronto to St. Catharines to the Chatham, Buxton, and then the area right around Windsor and emphasized here, but lots of also smaller communities. As I mentioned, that, you know, Detroit, the Detroit-Windsor connection is the largest. There are good studies of white Canadian movement, and they also show that Detroit is the key port for Canadians to enter the United States. So obviously the geography just kind of encourages that, and it's a geography many people probably on this call cross regularly, right? So you know, it's obvious that there's a clear point of connection there. We do have this wonderful international memorial now, you know, facing pointing back and forth, you know, from one to the other. But I think it is a connection that we can emphasize and really focus on individual families and individual landmarks in this space. And I'll emphasize some of those in the rest of my talk today. We have really some remarkable records. So I have a student this summer and I are working on this. This is the 1864 manuscript census of the town of Windsor. In the middle of the Civil War, they decided to do a kind of extra census because there are so many people moving back and forth between the US and Windsor, and they want to get a sense of who they are, right? Are they sort of worried? You can see there are people born in Virginia, right? Are they white? Are they Black? You know, is that a sign that there are people who are escaping slavery, or maybe a sign, as we know from the St. Albans raid, that people wanted to use Canada to attack the United States during the Civil War Confederates. So it's a remarkable resource. We're working on digitizing it and creating a map of all the black families we can see there. This is one version of that. Sorry, Wisconsin is still spelled wrong. I have to get that fixed. But one thing that this does is that it lists origin by state. Almost always the census only lists by country. This is a work with another student of mine, Nick Matson, and he showed that many people at least claimed that they were coming from very close by, Ohio or Michigan. Sometimes their family records showed that they were born further away, but at least their children had been born sort of right near Canada, and they were only crossing a short distance to Windsor in this period. This is part of my effort to match all those people, right? So these numbers can be updated. I think my current student researcher and I have matched many more, but this was a look at how we really can find records both in Canada and the United States before and after, right? Certain families stay put once they reach Windsor, but others we can see moving back to Ohio, to New York, to Michigan, to other places. Okay, so though I do think the efforts to have these migration numbers are important, I'm also very cognizant of these historians, Kendra Field and Jessica Marie Johnson, colleagues and friends, people I know in the field, about that there's so much of an effort when once things are turned into data, turned into numbers, we sometimes forget the real lives underneath, right? So, and as Kendra says here, microhistories allow us to see a more intimate, complex, and complete sense of African descended peoples. And so the book project is really trying to emphasize certain families in an effort to tell this story in a way that is much more with a human face. These are some of the key themes I've seen in the project: those who decided to fight against slavery or to fight during the Civil War, those in the moment of Reconstruction who are making an effort to include Black border crossers in government, whether that's in Victoria on the city council or in Alabama in the House of Representatives. I see lots of interesting opportunities to look at Black border crossers working, the first Black employee of Ford Motor Company, who we'll talk about, and other examples like that. And then similarly, efforts to build community, whether that's in the church, in schools, in lots of different kinds of organizations. So the way I've structured the research is like this, right? I've tried to build all those maps around individuals, right? So in this case, this is Eunice Shadd, born in Pennsylvania after her family had moved from Delaware, had spent time in Buxton and Chatham. By 1870, was back in Washington, D.C., where much of the Shadd family was at that point. And then in her case, had married, not married, her sister had married, I'm looking at it and getting it wrong. Eunice had married Mr. Lindsay, as you can see there, and had moved to Xenia, Ohio, which is where Wilberforce University was, and that is where she died, right? So I have various kind of smaller pieces of data like this that I want to kind of build up into a story focused on a certain number of families. Some of these people are familiar names, people we may know. Marianne Shadd Carey, I think, is probably the most famous of these Black African North Americans, these border crossers. Martin Delaney didn't spend as much time in Canada, but is a very prominent name in terms of rights in the United States and thinking about migration to the Caribbean or Africa. Anderson Abbott, who, as I mentioned before, is very proud of his time and lived most of his life in Toronto, but had served in the Civil War as a surgeon and then went back to Chicago and ran a hospital. Mifflin Gibbs had been in the California Gold Rush and then in Victoria on the city council before getting involved in politics in Arkansas, eventually becoming a judge there and then eventually an ambassador for the United States in Mozambique and elsewhere. And Mary Brantoulet is one of the many missionaries who I've come across who spent time first in Canada, but then trying to spread Christianity elsewhere. Finding the places of this, there are not so many places, right? Like as we know, I even know from my own family, like when you leave somewhere to move somewhere else, right, you don't necessarily have roots back in that place, or you're not able to both make a new life in your new country or new state and hold all those ties. So, Marianne Shadd Carey had a house in D.C. that is a landmark. It's a house where she was able to welcome in lots of Canadian cousins who went to Howard University, which is right nearby, and were able to get an education as well. And so, though a modest and pretty normal looking house for that section of Washington, D.C., it really emphasizes her ability to use border crossing as a way to advocate in D.C. for education. She goes to Howard Law School. She advocates for D.C. statehood, which still hasn't happened. She's advocating for women to get the right to vote before it happens as well, right? So I think her story is justly famous because it does have that rootedness in D.C. and in Canada that help us get a sense of her as a border crosser and using that opportunity to cross. But I found all kinds of other interesting little pieces, right? In the book I have now, I have more information than this. This was an older piece that said, yes, William Smallwood was a lawyer from Canada, and A.W. Shedd was either from Northern Ohio or Canada, which we know to be he had come from Canada. And there are others, right? There are these sort of little pieces of information that emphasized that there were Black members of the government in Alabama and in Mississippi who had come from Canada, which I think is, was remarkable at the time. Some of the white supremacists who opposed them call them like a colored alien in one of the quotations, right? That this Canadian had come and they should be removed. But it is a story that I don't think we think of, right? That I think there is movement to Detroit and to Ohio, but then there's also movement into the Deep South, which is in the book as well. There are a number of school desegregation cases in the United States that have links to Black Canadian families. So Detroit is one of them. There is one in Lockport, New York. I was writing about this last month, and so I cannot remember. There are at least two more. Well, there's one in one of the southern cities as well, and I'm not remembering the last one. But it's clear that the idea of getting desegregated schools and getting equal access is important to these Black border crossers. And so we can see a kind of vanguard of later civil rights concerns in that way through those connections. Similarly, it's called the Sunday School Union, right? Sort of a printing opportunity for Black church materials is run by Charles Spencer Smith. He stays in Canada with his sister, who becomes Lucy Thurman, if you know that name, a temperance activist. They get their education in Canada. He actually moves all around. As you can see, he was a preacher and then a member of the House of Representatives. And then he ends up in Nashville running the Sunday School Union for most of his career, though he also spends time in Africa and West Indies as a missionary. So that's the kind of movement and the kind of varied experience that I was able to find in focusing on some of these families. He had his papers at the University of Michigan. I was able to give you a list of resources, and so that's something you might be interested in as well. Here's a very different story. Both the man named on this salmon label, John Sullivan Deas, and the man on the right there, Grafton Tyler Brown, who creates this label, are people who were born as African Americans. In the case of Brown, he's passing as completely white when he dies near Yellowstone later on. But Deas is probably the first person creating a successful canning outfit with their own labels in the Fraser River near what's now Vancouver. Unfortunately, he dies of metal poisoning because the canning is involves lots of toxic metal processes. But he was able to make enough money to set up his wife and children in a house, a boarding house in Oregon, right? That they buy a house and she sort of uses it as a boarding house to keep the family afloat after he dies. I think he's only like 42 when he dies. But it's one of the many stories like Mifflin Gibbs of Black border crossing in the Pacific Northwest, which I think people who really know the Ontario story or the story of the Maritimes don't always focus on that area way out there. Elias Jones is another really interesting case, one of many Black families who were educated at Oberlin, because Oberlin is really the first school to welcome men and women, Black and white, before the Civil War. His family, he was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, but his parents had been able to move him to the Oberlin area. Gunsmith Jones, if you know that name, from the southwestern Ontario region, is his brother, James Jones. I think that's right, not his father. I'd have to double check, but I think that's right. But there are a number of Jones families who move back and forth to Chatham, but in his case, Elias's case, and his brother William, all the way to Barkersville in British Columbia, where they take their chances at the mining. He keeps a home that's still visitable today in Oberlin, Ohio, and in the Oberlin records, that they're always saying like, oh, well, you know, who knows who this person is who moved to British Columbia? And they say, well, ask Elias Jones. He knows. And he generally does, right? He knows who died in British Columbia, who was able to come back, who was still living there. And so he's really a key point of connection between the family in Ohio and family members he has both in British Columbia and in Chatham. And again, I think we often think of like global travel as a modern thing, but here's somebody, you know, who's going back and forth, as you can see in the bottom corner there, between British Columbia and Oberlin over the course of many years in the late 1800s. Before, as he says on that, you can see he proudly says, "I'm retired and I don't plan to do anything," once he gets back to his house in Oberlin. The largest Black-owned bank in the United States was the Binga Bank in Chicago up through the Great Depression. He has a number of different banks and real estate holdings, but Jesse is born in Detroit in 1865, but Anthony Binga is his, Anthony Binga Sr. is his grandfather, and Anthony Binga Jr. is his uncle. That he's the child of William Binga, and William's branch got invested in real estate both in Detroit and in St. Paul, Minnesota. There was Binga's Row, and then Jesse gets involved with banking and real estate in Chicago. And so there's a great interview that I talk about in the book where he's proud to have all these Black college graduates as his bank tellers. Like he walks somebody around and shows them, and he builds this big building, the one you see here on the corner, but then he builds even a bigger building after that. And unfortunately, he's ruined by the Great Depression, right? Before the United States has, deposit insurance. When the Depression comes, the crash comes, and he's has to become personally liable for that. But it is clearly a story of Black economic success linked to this border crossing family. As I mentioned before, the first Black employee of Ford Motor Company is William Perry, related to Walter Perry of the Emancipation celebrations in Windsor. He had been on near land owned by Henry Ford, sort of outside of Detroit, and they had worked together logging, helping clear the land when Henry Ford wanted to build a kind of a country house. He had worked as a bricklayer, and then once he was no longer able to do that, he went to the Ford Motor factory and said, Mr. Ford will remember me. And Henry Ford himself personally vouched for William Perry, and he became the first Black employee of Ford Motor. So you can see him sort of taller than everybody else on the left side of the photograph there. Obviously, with the Great Migration, both the Binga financing and the opportunities to work at places, industries like Ford Motor really were transformational of the experience of African Americans in the United States, and obviously with Ford Canada and others, it's a cross-border experience. And I think it's though they talk about William Perry in the Ford Museum, they don't emphasize the fact that he's born in Amherstburg, right? So I think there really is a lot of these stories that are cross-border, and that people get used to telling very much a story on one side of the line, and they forget that it's important to emphasize this border crossing as part of the story. You can see, yes, there's his death certificate, which lists Amherstburg as his birthplace, sort of about a third of the way down on the left side, if you want to see it there. One more that I'll emphasize today, because there's stories of both men and women. So Georgina, Mingo, Whetsel, Moore is written about in this compendium of Black success stories right around the turn of the 20th century as the richest Black woman in Canada. From her first husband, she inherits a ice harvesting business in New Brunswick, and that's really the source of her money. She had grown up in Nova Scotia, but remarkably, both her first husband, Mr. Whetsel, and her second husband, Mr. Moore, she meets in Boston. So her sister is living in Boston in the first case, and she goes and works in someone's house for a little while and eventually meets her husband, moves to New Brunswick. But it's clear that like the opportunity to have Boston as this hub of what we think of as, New England and the Maritime provinces, gives her opportunities, in this case, to marry, but in case of others, to be educated or to get jobs, that opens up new doors. So she owns this ice harvesting business in New Brunswick and eventually retires back to Nova Scotia with her second husband. But another case where the border crossing was really influential in allowing her to live the life that she does. I think that's my last slide. Yes. So I'm back to my cover slide here. As I said, there are lots and lots and lots of families. As I've tried to narrow this down, I had a chance to really write up about 100 family stories. I think the book, based on what the publisher wants, is really going to focus around 4 families, but we're going to try to bring in as many of these border crossing experiences as we can to get a real sense of what I think is this is a really important piece of the puzzle, right? People know about the Underground Railroad, people know about the Great Migration, but this is another key moment of movement and migration, border crossing in the Emancipation in the Emancipation Generation, that really changes the face of Black North America, both in the United States and Canada. And so I'm excited to be working on this project. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I learned something new from you every time I hear you speak. So thank you so much. So if anyone wanted to ask a question, you can raise your hand or type it into the chat. And while we're waiting for that, I actually have several questions. So my first question is, and it's something I've always been interested in knowing. It's about citizenship and the idea of citizenship. I mean, today, and I know we can't apply what's happening today to the past, but now we have official documents that declare our citizenship. But can you talk to or speak about what citizenship was like back then? Because when I think of it, I think once you touched Canadian soil, under the law, you were protected as a free person on Canadian soil, and that protected you under the law. But in terms of citizenship, what was it like back then in the 19th century, especially?
Right. So both the United States and British North America, right, and what becomes Canada, have to figure out what they want that to look like, right? They have changed their mind at different times about what citizenship will look like. The United States, for example, before there's Ellis Island, each state is making their own decisions. That citizenship is seen as state, a part of your relationship to your state, not to the country. And that's part of what goes on in the Dred Scott case, is saying there's no such thing as national citizenship. And that only changes with Reconstruction, with the 14th Amendment in the United States, where it says, no, through birthright citizenship, anyone born in the United States, even if they just got here today, is now a citizen. What's happening in British North America before Confederation is you could pledge allegiance to the Queen, and then you were a subject of the British Empire, right? So there wasn't citizenship. It really was subjecthood, and many of the people talk about how they thought that was a better thing, right? That they sort of thought that that their rights were being protected by Queen Victoria, and that gave them an opportunity to have certain rights that were not being recognized in the United States. Once Canada is established, I think I don't know enough about all the details in terms of what happens in the early Confederation period, but that is an ongoing question, right? It's sort of like, what does it mean to be a citizen? How is citizenship determined? Is it by birthright? Is it by where your parents are citizens? Now we have a concept of dual citizenship, which is not really a thing at the time. Like, for example, so some Americans have, some of these Black Americans go to British Columbia, sign, and Toronto too, and they sign oaths of allegiance to the Queen, and then they come back to the United States. And sometimes when they want to run for office, there's a question, well, were you ever, did you ever have allegiance to someone else? And all they have to do is like, say, well, I renounce my allegiance to the Queen, and now I, under the 14th Amendment, I take up citizenship in the United States. That was enough. But there is also a process that begins in 1870 where, according to U.S. law, only white people were allowed to become citizens from 1790 forward. It's an issue actually all the way into the 20th century until the 1965 national origins laws get reformed in the United States. But until that point, if you wanted to become a citizen, you had to be white until 1870, when they decided you can be white or black. And that law is actually written, I think, for the families of the Underground Railroad. And there are a few cases of people whose parents or grandparents have been born in the United States, but they were born in Canada, where I found citizenship papers where they are, becoming naturalized as American citizens because their parents had fled to what's now Canada. Right. So, yeah, the citizenship piece is very complicated. And it is, at least in the United States, it's very much racially determined. I know there's a similar version in Canada in the early 20th century about who was allowed to move to Alberta, for example. But, you have all these cases in the United States where people from India or Syria or other places, they have to, or even, Korea, have to sort of argue that they are white because the laws are such that if they were to, the only options are white or black. And if they come to the United States as black, then the Jim Crow laws are going to limit their opportunities. Right. So it's not, though, I don't know if we think of citizenship as simple now, but I think that it was more complex in this period than it is now.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for giving such a thorough answer to such a complicated topic, and thank you. That does really answer my question. I did have another question as well. At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the museum in Cincinnati, which I've gone to as well. It's a great museum, and you talked about the Beyond Freedom section. I guess this is kind of a two-part question. Do you know if the museum has any intentions, or if they have made adjustments to that Beyond Freedom section to include the presence of Black Canadians or the border crossers into Canada? And then the second part of my question, which I can repeat after you've answered the first part, is why do you think there is such a focus on the Underground Railroad period? And then with the post-Underground Railroad period, it's just, well, everything was great. People moved to Canada, and there's no real discussion or correct discussion or real discussion of what happened to settlers once they came to Canada. So I'm just curious about those two things.
Yeah. I haven't, I will definitely go back to the museum, as this book is finished, and I will engage with them more. I haven't had a chance to do that. So I don't think it's changed, but I'm not sure. But as for why, I think that people are desperate to find some stories of heroism and some stories that seem to have a quote unquote happy ending in this period, right? That, I think the recent Underground Railroad novel actually, though obviously it has lots of inventions, things that aren't true in the history, it does maintain the sense of kind of uncertainty and lack of happiness that I think is a much more realistic vision of what the Underground Railroad was like, right? I think partially in an effort to find a story of resistance and heroism that we want to tell, elementary school children, we've really focused on moments that look like they are kind of happy endings, where this was a struggle. I mean, it was a struggle whether you were on your own land in Buxton, or whether you were, living in Windsor, or whether you were living in New York or California, wherever it was, right? There isn't a simple answer. And I think, I think a lot of the earliest efforts to tell the story of the Underground Railroad were focused on white heroism, right? That some of the early books were written by white abolitionists who sort of were, there was actually a colleague named Scott Gack has written about how there was like this celebration where people got together, white abolitionists, and congratulated themselves on how slavery was over and everything was solved, right? This is in the late 19th century, as Jim Crow is the law of the land. So there were people who were proud of what they had done, but they hadn't really thought about the ongoing struggle. And so I think some of them, maybe especially in the United States, wanted to think like, oh, I got somebody to Canada, and now everything's happy. Everything is solved for them. And there clearly are families that have prospered in after slavery in both the United States and Canada, but obviously that's not the entire story. And I think by focusing on this generation, that in my talking with descendant families, a lot of people know the story of the escape. Sometimes this second generation story isn't as well known, and there's a lot of scholarship actually in the psychology of genocide and trauma and of migration that this is a common thing, right? So whether it's survivors of the Nazi atrocities, or of what genocide in Cambodia, or wherever it happens to be, that sometimes that next generation that's just trying to survive, their story isn't explained, right? Isn't talked as much about. They're really focused on what they can do to memorialize the people who went through what they see as the worst experience, and they're not telling as much about the next generation. So I think that's part of the puzzle with this project as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I mean, I think in Canada here as well, we tend to latch on to the promised land vision of Canada, and it's difficult to persuade people that it's a little bit more complex than that. So I did have one more question. So the Buxton Genealogy Conference is coming up. I believe it's on September 1st. I was just wondering, I believe you're going to be speaking there
Yeah.
again. And I was just wondering if you could just tell our audience a little bit about more about that.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the 100th Buxton Homecoming coming up, and it's an honor to be chosen to speak on on Friday. There's like a history and genealogy conference before the parties and parades and baseball and all that goes on over the whole weekend. What I'm going to be emphasizing there is thinking about like where family history fits into a larger history, right? That I think some people think like, oh, well, my family did this, but like, why would a historian want to know about that? Or, how could this photograph tell a bigger story? And I think as this project has shown me, I've been researching all of these individual families that I'm finding through these records. And, they're all touching a piece of this bigger puzzle, right? When we talk about the Underground Railroad, or we talk about enlistment in World War I or World War II, or the Great Migration, right? That's a big story that involves millions of people. But it's built up out of individual family stories, right? So it's important for people to recognize those connections, to record their family histories, to preserve their family histories, and to share them so that people can see these ties across different groups. So that's one of the things I'll be talking about there over Labor Day.
Well, I look forward to hearing it at the conference. So I'll just double check in the chat. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any further questions, so I guess we can just end it there. I just wanted to thank you again so much for such an interesting presentation, and thank you to everyone in our audience for joining. And again, this is recorded and it will be uploaded onto our YouTube page, our website, and our Facebook page as well. So people can watch it for the first time or again. So thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to hearing more from you at the Buxton Conference. So thank you again, everyone.
Great, thank you.